Now, one of those summers, when I was working at camp, I brought this new tool that I had that I hoped was going to totally change my experience. It was an alarm clock, a flashlight, a notepad, a word processor, a Bible, and it would even have received and sent phone calls if I had service. This was my first smartphone. It was an iPhone. And I loved it. iPhones truly are the most useful tool that we have. I will challenge anybody on that. Now, this summer, it was perfect for me. I was leading a bunch of teenagers. I used it on our wilderness camp, and I didn't need it plugged in because that was back when phones could last 3 days on a charge. Remember that? But one weekend, we were camping on a beach, and I went to walk out to the boat, anchored in the water, and as I climbed onto the boat, I felt something solid against my skin. And I reached in, and it was my cherished iPhone. This was also before waterproof was a thing. My beloved tool was rendered completely and utterly useless. It could only be used as a paperweight, which is ironic because it had rendered all the paper redundant in my life. And as I sat there in frustration, realizing the money that I had lost and all of the utility I had lost, I don't think that was even close to how Jesus felt when he walked in through the temple gates into his Father's house, where people were supposed to come from all the nations, all around the world, find rest, find peace, find connection with their Creator. And instead of finding a house of prayer, he found a den of robbers. People set up waiting to take advantage of anybody who was gullible enough or desperate enough to trust them. Last week, Peter preached on Mark 11, which was Jesus entering the temple, clearing it out, and also cursing the fig tree. And Peter showed us the connection between the two of them was neither were producing fruit. The fig tree physically not producing the fruit it was supposed to, and the temple not producing the spiritual fruit it was supposed to. And the implications for our lives were very explicit. Be people who produce fruit. Now, going back to Jesus, you cannot create that kind of a stir and cause that ruckus in the temple and then slip into obscurity once again. And so, after that happened, the leaders of the temple, the religious leaders, went and found Jesus. And they asked him, by what authority did you go in and completely upset our temple system? And among other things, Jesus' response was this parable we're going to look at today. So join me in Mark 12, verse 1. It's on the screen. Follow it in your Bibles as well. Then Jesus began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. But they seized him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Then he sent another servant to them. They struck this man on the head and treated him shamefully. He sent still another, and this one they killed. He sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. He had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, "They will respect my son." But the tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they took him and killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Haven't you read this passage of Scripture? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Then the chief priests the teachers of the law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him, because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. We cannot understand this parable from Jesus unless we try to read it like a Jew in Jesus' day. There's a lot of Old Testament allusion that is packed into this seemingly simple tenant-landlord dispute. Israel, throughout the prophets, is often displayed as a vineyard, and the fruit of the vineyard is often associated with Israel being faithful to their God, Yahweh. That means obeying the Torah. That's the first 5 books of our Bible. And throughout Israel's history, whether or not they followed God, were faithful to God, and obeyed, usually depended on their leaders. So you'll notice as you go through the book of 2 Kings that sometimes there was a king in power who was faithful to God. And he would make sure everybody else in Israel was following and doing what they should have with their covenant regulations. But then his son or his grandson would come into power, and he would be tempted, he would be swayed to follow the gods of the nations around. Maybe they didn't offer as stringent policies. Maybe he liked the personal benefits that he got from it. But either way, he would change and he would redirect the course of Israel. And so now they would be worshiping a different God, forsaking the God of their past. It's very much like our modern democracies, actually, where one government is in power for 4 years, and the next one comes in and totally reverses what had happened. So this is old, ancient news. Now, at this time, they didn't have political governments, but they had their own religious governance. And that's the leaders, the elders, teachers of the law, who, ironically, realize that Jesus is telling this parable about them. They identify as the tenants in the garden. So on one level, yes, this is Jesus' commentary on their current setting. But on another level, Jesus is talking about the relationship between Israel, who at this point are now called the Jews, and their God, Yahweh. Yahweh, the God who gave them his personal name. Yahweh, the God who rescued them from slavery in Egypt. Yahweh, the God who gave this tribe of wanderers somewhere to call home. Yahweh, Yahweh, the God who did not remain aloof in his heavenly temple, but condescended, stooped down, and made a contract with humans. This is unheard of in religious history. So I don't know if you realize this, but your salvation story does not start at the moment you believed in Jesus, the moment you were baptized, or the moment that you finally realized the truth. Your salvation story stretches back past this parable, before King David. It stretches all the way back to when God decided he was no longer content to let humanity flounder in our sin, in our despair, and instead he was going to take action. And he started by making a contract with humanity. And if we don't understand this, if we don't understand covenant, which is just another word for contract, we actually will misunderstand the Bible. And so I want you to watch this video that we have queued up, talking about covenant. The video was made by The Bible Project. It's a website with lots of videos like this explaining complicated theological ideas, but distilling it into a fairly entertaining little soundbite. So as that video explained, God didn't choose Israel because they were particularly special in any way, but he chose them so that through Israel, he could bring everybody in the world back into a loving, fulfilling relationship with him. But Israel didn't do it, as you saw with the shattered handshakes. And so God sent prophet after prophet in this parable identified as servants, and also called so in the prophets. And prophet after prophet went to realign Israel back with their covenant promises, with the partnership that they had with God. And they failed. They refused. As the parable says, they treated them with disregard, disrespect, with abuse. Some of them died. But the last one that the man, the landlord, had was his son. And it's quite interesting to see how Jesus talks about the son and the death of the son here in this parable. Because Jesus has already told his disciples, I'm going to die. Jesus, twice before, is the one who is loved by God. So we already know that Jesus is talking about himself here in this parable. And what he says about his death gives us insight into how he interprets what's going to happen on the cross. And what Jesus' original audience didn't quite understand is that Jesus' death came with a twist. He would become the cornerstone that the new covenant is based on. Now, what is a cornerstone? Because I don't build. I've never encountered a cornerstone before. But Kathy and I occasionally make puzzles. And when we make puzzles, Kathy tries to find the pieces that obviously fit together and starts there. She'll look for the red barn pieces or the yellow flower. I will look for the corner pieces and then the edges and try to position everything else in relation to that. So I'll start with find whatever the bottom right corner is and usually work from there. That's the idea of a cornerstone. It's the first stone that's laid down, and everything else in your structure is relative to that. So you know where this stone goes because of where it is positioned based on the cornerstone. Sometimes it could also be translated capstone, which is the stone in an arch. If you're building your arch, you need one right in the middle that is the missing link that holds the whole arch together. Now, in this parable, the tenants kill the son in an attempt to get rid of him, but it only makes him more indispensable because now he is the cornerstone. But a cornerstone of what? You remember in the parable, the landlord said, I will take this vineyard from you and give it to others. That, we know, is the church. It's the same vineyard, still the same purpose, designed to go and create a way for people to come back to God. But it is now under new management and it has new members. So two of the early church leaders, Peter and Paul, both heard what Jesus said here and understood it to mean that Jesus was now the cornerstone of the church, and all of us who follow Jesus are being built together like little spiritual stones, Peter says, 1 Peter 2:7. We're being built together to become a temple for God. Do you think of our church as a temple for God? A place where God dwells, where people meet with God. And I don't mean the theater space that we are in, but the relationships that we have with each other. We are created to be a temple for God. And our mandate has not changed. This new vineyard, which is now the church, still has the same task of bearing fruit for Yahweh. The old covenant, the first way of doing things, did not bear the fruit it was supposed to. It was broken. It was useless. It was like a waterlogged iPhone. But the new vineyard, the church, has been tasked with bearing fruit. And at Northern Hills Church, we describe bearing fruit as living and leading toward God. So the following are some thoughts on how we as a community can live towards God, and then after that, lead. Because if we are not living towards God, we can't lead other people towards God. So I want you to take these thoughts, and maybe something will jump out at you in the service today. Maybe it'll be later on this week. I want you just to reflect on which of these can you participate in to help Northern Hills Church bear fruit for the kingdom. And they're through the acronym PUBLIC, because we're doing this together and because it worked. So first, participation. The church was always supposed to be a grassroots movement that was propelled to success through the active participation of all of its members. So the Apostle Paul is fond of talking about the church as a body. He says this particularly in 1 Corinthians 12. He says that some are the hands, some are the heads, the eyes, the ears, the feet, but all parts have to play their part for the body to fully function. This last December, I was infected with a virus that gave me temporary arthritis in my knees and my ankles. And I quickly learned how important it is to walk properly so that my leg muscles function properly, so that my back functions properly, so that I can be in a good mood around my wife. Interesting how it's all connected. And just like the human body is interconnected and one part relies on the other, our church relies on each individual member participating with your strengths, with your gifts, with your passions, with your own vocations. And it is when we all come together and function as a body that the church is fully healthy and is operating the way that Christ designed it. So my question for you to reflect on is, what is your level of participation right now in our church life? You participate in the Sunday mornings, obviously. What about during the week? What about relationships with other people that are outside of sanctioned church time? What is your participation level? And what do you have to bring that will make our church stronger, more effective, and more fruitful? Reflect on this week. I would love to hear what you have to say. The next is unity. There's nothing that hampers the effectiveness of a church or poisons our fruit faster than a lack of unity. The strength of our church lies in our ability to look past our differences, to look past the conflicts that we have, to the one thing that binds us together, and that is Jesus. It doesn't mean that we agree on everything. That would be rather boring. But it does mean that when we disagree, we do it in a way that is loving and seeks the best for the other person. And we don't let the self rear its ugly head and take over. But instead, we work towards the mission of God together. We cannot allow grudges and bitterness to take root in our community. Hebrews calls it the root of bitterness, because it sinks in deep and it infects all parts of our being, and it really renders our church impotent if we cannot work together. If we will not reflect the love of our triune God, who is three in one, who is a perfect picture of community working together. But if we allow our bitterness, our grudges, conflicts that we have, if we wish something would have been different, you really did not like the song Peter chose this morning. They were good songs. But if we allow that to sink in, it poisons our tree. And we will not produce fruit for the kingdom. I want you to remember this encouragement from Ecclesiastes 4, verse 9 to 12. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. My question for you is, are you allowing something, some past event, some prejudice, some disagreement, to drive a wedge between you and someone else in our church. Unfortunately, grudges, bitterness, and conflict that is not dealt with does more damage to the church than the devil ever could. And the truth is, this is in our hands. This is something we have complete control over. We are not victims to it. We choose to live in that. And so is there something driving a wedge between you and fully, actively participating in the church body with everybody? And if there is, it's time for you and Jesus to sit down and to deal with it. Next, we bear fruit through baptism. Baptism, for those of you who may not know, is a public declaration that you are going to follow Jesus. And we do it in our church community because you're becoming a part of this community. Throughout time, we have baptism and we have the Lord's Supper. These are the two ordinances that we have had since the beginning of the church. And baptism has always been the entrance into the community. It's the door you walk in to become a part of the church. It's a ritual as old as Jesus himself. And it is where we go underwater and we die to our old selves, to our sin, just like Jesus died on the cross. And then we emerge from the water, a new creation, free of everything that was holding us back, hampering our relationship with God. Just like Jesus rose from the tomb, alive and renewed. This is baptism. And if anybody here is ready to follow Jesus, maybe you've already started following Jesus, but you haven't taken this step, please come talk to us. We want to celebrate this momentous, life-changing decision with you in the way that all the Christians before you have done. And that is through baptism. You're stepping into the tradition of Christians reaching back to Jesus' day. Love. We bear fruit through the love in our community. We use the word love for so many different things, and the meaning is easily lost. I probably say that I love my wife's cooking too much. I really mean I like my wife's cooking. Or we use it to mean affection, like when couples fall in love. But the truth is, biblical love is very different than these. I don't want to get too particular about definitions because you know love when you see it. But love is this unconditional regard for somebody else. It is choosing to put the other person before you, choosing to be on their side and look after their welfare. It's an action, not a feeling, not an emotion. And there's a writer in the New Testament named John, spent 3 years with Jesus, one of his closest disciples. He, through that time, understood love to a level that no other writer has. And this is what he said regarding love. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Love is truly impossible to separate from sacrifice. It is the hallmark of a Christian community, and you cannot follow Jesus if you are not loving others. Do we have a culture of love here in Northern Hills? And how can you contribute to it? How can you become a part of the fruit here at Northern Hills, being born through love? We cannot bear fruit without intimacy. And not the intimacy of my wife and I, but the intimacy between friends. the intimacy between two people who are earnestly looking out for the other. And intimacy involves getting beneath the surface, being vulnerable with each other. And if a church lacks intimacy and vulnerability, then we will not encourage each other in our faith. And we certainly can't hold each other accountable to Christ-likeness. But another thing about intimacy, it only comes through spending time with each other. Like trust, there is no shortcut. It comes through intentionally structuring your life in a way that you are with others here in our church, and you're deepening your relationship, whether that's through our connection groups throughout the week or joining together in other ways, putting your kids on the same hockey team. I hear hockey parents have to spend a lot of time together and develop intimacy. But if our church is not seeking each other out outside of Sunday mornings, we'll be fruitless, unable to participate in God's mission to redeem the world. And lastly, Christ-likeness. If our church is not turning at people to be more like Christ, then we are missing the most basic fruit that there is. And when people come into our community, are they inspired to become more like Christ? Or are they encouraged to stay at the status quo? This is my question for you. That's living towards God. Public living towards God. Leading towards God is very simple. It's simply inviting people in to this community that we are building that is participative, that's unified, that celebrates baptism, practices intimacy, and is Christ-like, with love where it needs to be. And leading is inviting your friends, your family, your neighbors, other people to come and experience what God really has in store for them through the fruit in Northern Hills. Now, you remember my useless paperweight, that iPhone. I did everything I could to try and dry it out. I put it in rice, wrapped it in paper towel, left it in the sun. Nothing worked. It was useless. Near the end of the summer, my dad came to the camp. He was dropping something off. So I asked him to try and just to take it back and see what Apple could do. I don't know how he told me because he clearly didn't call me, but I found out that when he brought the phone back to Apple, they were happy that he was honest about what had happened to the phone, and they gave me a brand new iPhone to replace the one that I'd walked into a lake with. And they won my customer loyalty, as you see. Same phone, same applications, same utility, but it was new and it was doing what it was supposed to. So please, come be a part of Northern Hills Church, producing fruit in the kingdom. Let us do what God intended us to do, and let us create a community where people become more like Christ.